The stagecoach rolled into Caldwell, Kansas on a Thursday in the summer of 1878, and the woman who stepped off it looked at the town like she was deciding whether it was worth the trouble. Her name was Della, and she was 26 years old, and she had traveled from Richmond, Virginia with one trunk, one carpetbag, a small sum of money she had earned herself through 4 years of working as a seamstress, and a clarity of purpose that most people spend their entire lives never finding. She wore a dress the color of cedar bark, practical and well-made, and her dark hair was pinned up with the kind of efficiency that suggested she had no patience for arrangements that came loose at inconvenient moments. She was not beautiful in the way that made men go quiet in the middle of a sentence, though that would happen too, eventually. She was beautiful in the way that made men realize, several seconds after looking at her, that they had stopped breathing without meaning to. Caldwell was a cattle town. In 1878, it sat at the edge of the Kishom Trail like a man leaning against a fence post, watching the herds come through, taking its share of the money that moved with them. The main street had a hotel, a general store, a land office, a barber, 2 saloons, a church that was only half finished, and a blacksmith. The population was roughly 400 souls, give or take whoever had ridden in from the trail camps that week. Dust settled on everything like a second skin. The summer heat was the kind that made the air shimmer at the edges, and men who had lived there for years still squinted against it like it surprised them every morning. Della stepped off the stagecoach onto the packed dirt street, set her carpetbag down at her feet, and looked at the land office across the road. Then she picked her bag back up and walked directly toward it, not stopping to take in the scenery, not pausing to absorb the strangeness of a new place. She had looked at this town in her mind for 6 months. She had written letters to the land office, received letters back, made her arrangements, and now she was here. There was no reason to hesitate. The man inside the land office was named Gerald Cobb, and he was 53 years old, soft in the middle, and accustomed to speaking to women the way a schoolteacher speaks to a child who has wandered into the wrong classroom. He looked up when Della walked in, and his expression shifted into the particular kind of smile that was not really a smile at all, the kind that was waiting for her to explain herself. "Ma'am," he said, leaning back in his chair, "something I can help you with." "Yes," Della said. "I am here to complete the claim on the Hayes parcel. 40 acres on the South Fork of Bluff Creek, filed under my father's name, Edmund Hayes, who died in March. I have the transfer documents, the proof of relation, and the filing fee." Gerald Cobb blinked. "Now, ma'am, I believe there may be some confusion. That land can't just transfer to a woman," Della said pleasantly. "That is what you are about to say. However, the Homestead Act of 1862 does not prohibit women from inheriting and maintaining a homestead claim, provided the filing is in order. My father filed the original claim in 1874. He improved the land, built a structure, and made it his primary residence. His death does not void the claim. His heir, which is me, may continue it. I have looked into this matter thoroughly." Gerald Cobb stared at her for a moment that stretched out like taffy being pulled from both ends. Then he looked down at the papers she had placed on his desk. He had worked in this office for 11 years, and he could not, in that moment, think of a single clear objection that would hold up if she pushed back on it. She pushed back on everything. He could tell that from looking at her. He processed the paperwork. Outside, while she waited for her trunk to be unloaded from the stage, 3 men from the Comstock Ranch who had been watching from the saloon porch made their way across the street with the easy confidence of men who had never been told no in a way that stuck. The one in front was named Harlan Voss. He was 35, broad-shouldered, and had the kind of tan that came from years of sun and the kind of expression that came from years of being told he was charming. "Well now," he said, stopping a few feet from her and hooking his thumbs in his belt. "You must be lost, sweetheart. The hotel's 2 doors down." Della glanced at him with the brief, uncomplicated attention she might have given a signpost. "I'm not lost. I know where the hotel is, thank you." "Where are you headed to, then?" "A woman alone out here. I am going to my property on Bluff Creek," Della said. "I will need to hire someone with a wagon. If you know someone reliable, I would appreciate the recommendation. If you are simply passing time, I am going to be too busy for that." Harlan Voss laughed, but there was a hollow space in the center of the laugh where his confidence had been a moment before. His two companions exchanged a look that said something without words. "She's something," one of them muttered. "She's trouble," the other said. Neither of them was wrong. The wagon hire was arranged through the general store, with a man named Pete Haverson who had a mule and a philosophical attitude toward women who knew their own minds. He drove Della and her trunk out along the creek road that afternoon, and by the time the sun was dropping toward the low hills in the west, she had seen her property for the first time. Her father had built a cabin. It was small, solid, weathered to the color of driftwood, sitting in a clearing where cottonwood trees leaned over the creek like they were listening to something in the water. The land around it was good land, flat and dark-soiled near the creek, rising to better-drained ground further back. There were remnants of a kitchen garden near the cabin door, mostly gone to weeds now after months without tending, but the bones of it were there. A small corral, empty. A well with a rope and bucket. Della stood in the yard and looked at all of it for a long moment. Her father had come out here after her mother died, chasing something she had never fully understood, some idea of starting over in a place wide enough that the grief could spread out and thin itself. He had sent her letters about the land, about the sky, about the way the grass moved in the wind. He had been happy here, she thought. In the way a man can be happy when he is running away from something, and the running itself becomes the point. She had not come here to run away from anything. She had come here because there was 40 acres of good land with her name on it now, and because Richmond, Virginia held nothing for her anymore, and because 26 years of other people telling her what she ought to want had worn down some patience in her that she preferred to use for other things. "You sure about this?" Pete Haverson said from the wagon seat. "Yes," Della said. "It's a lot of work for one person." "Then I will work a lot," she said. She unloaded her trunk herself. Pete helped because she let him, not because she needed him to. The first week was the hardest kind of hard, which is to say it was the kind that you have to move through with your teeth set and your hands occupied. The cabin needed airing out, which she did. The garden needed clearing, which she did. The well rope was frayed and needed replacing, which she arranged in town on her second trip. She bought supplies at the general store, making a list of everything she needed in the precise order she planned to use it, which made the store owner, a man named Arthur Finch, blink at her for a moment before filling her order without the usual commentary about whether she might not be better off finding someone to help her with all this. She cooked her own meals on the cast iron stove her father had installed, which was a good stove, well made, and she was grateful for it. She swept the cabin floor until the boards showed their actual color again. She repaired the hinge on the shuttered window. She pulled weeds until her hands ached and then pulled more weeds. At night she read by lamplight from the 3 books she had packed, which were a farming almanac, a collection of botanical illustrations with notes, and a novel she had already read twice and brought anyway because sometimes a familiar story is what you need at the end of a long day. It was on the 8th day that she met Wallace Merritt. She was mending the corral fence, which had a section of rail that had come loose from its post, when she heard hoofbeats on the creek road. Not the sound of someone hurrying, just the ordinary rhythm of a horse covering ground. She kept working and let the rider come to her, because the fence needed mending whether there was someone on the road or not. He stopped his horse at the edge of her property line, which was a courtesy she noticed. He did not ride in without an invitation. He was sitting a roan horse that looked well-kept and even-tempered, and he himself looked approximately the same way. He was 30 years old, lean and weathered in the honest way of a man who worked outdoors, with dark blonde hair under a hat that had been through some weather, and gray-green eyes that were looking at her fence with the same practical appraisal she had been giving it herself. "That post is heeled over about 2 inches, he said. "You'll need to reset it or the rail will just come loose again." I know, Della said. I am resetting it. I am currently assessing the depth of the hole. It's probably about 18 inches. Your father dug them to 18 inches when he set this fence. She looked up at him. You knew my father. Some. He was a decent neighbor. He paused. I am sorry for your loss. Thank you, she said, and she meant it, and he could tell she meant it because there was no performance in the way she said it. He swung down off the horse and looped the reins over the corral rail without asking if it was all right, though he glanced at her as he did it and waited for her to object. She did not object. He crouched down beside the post and looked at the hole. You need a digging bar to loosen the base, he said. That soil is packed. You push a regular post-hole digger in there and you'll be fighting it all afternoon. I do not have a digging bar, Della said. I have been managing. I have one on the pack. I'm heading into town, but I can leave it. He glanced up at her. I'll pick it up next time I pass through. No rush. Della looked at him for a moment. He was not helping in the way men sometimes helped, with the air of doing her a great favor and expecting some adjustment in the universe in return. He was offering because it was useful and the thing needed doing. She could read the difference. That would be appreciated, she said. I am Della Hayes. Wallace Merritt, he said. I have the spread about 3 miles east, along the South Fork. Your neighbor. He got the digging bar from his pack horse, which she had not noticed trailing behind the roan, and he set it against the fence post. He did not take over the work. He showed her how the bar worked against the compacted soil, demonstrated twice, and then handed it to her and watched her do it herself. And when she did it correctly, which she did on the second try, he simply nodded in the way of someone who expected nothing less. The soil out here is harder than Virginia soil, she said, working the bar. Clay underneath, he said. About 8 inches down you hit it. It's good for building on, bad for deep posts unless you break through it. What about the garden near the cabin, the clay layer? Your father dug out a bed about a foot deep and filled it with creek bottom soil. You can see where he did it. The surface sits a little higher than the surrounding yard. The plants should take well if you clear it properly. Della rested the bar for a moment and looked at him with a directness that would have made most men shift their weight from foot to foot. Wallace Merritt did not shift. He looked back at her with the same directness, comfortable in it, like a man who was not afraid of being looked at clearly. You are not going to tell me this is too much work for a woman, she said. No, he said. Why not? He thought about it for a moment, genuinely thought about it. Because it is not too much work for anyone willing to put in the work, he said. And you seem like someone willing to put in the work. Della went back to the digging bar. After a moment she said, You are right about that. He stayed another 10 minutes, not because she needed him to, but because they had fallen into an easy, practical conversation about the creek land, about what grew well there and what did not, about the water levels in summer and the flooding risk in spring. He answered her questions directly and without condescension, and she asked them without preamble or softening, and it was the most comfortable conversation she had had since leaving Virginia, possibly the most comfortable conversation she had had in a very long time. When he mounted his horse to go, he said, Caldwell on Saturdays is the best time for the general store. Finch gets his supply wagon Friday nights. Thank you, she said. He nodded once and rode on, and Della reset the fence post, and it held. The town of Caldwell had opinions about Della Hayes within her first 2 weeks there, because Caldwell was a town of approximately 400 opinions and very little restraint in sharing them. The women at the church, which she began attending on Sunday mornings because she had always attended church and saw no reason to stop, were divided. Half of them thought she was admirable in the abstract way that people admire things from a safe distance. The other half thought she was strange, which was the word they used for women who did not explain themselves or soften their edges to fit the available space. The men were more uniformly confused by her. She walked into the saloon on her 3rd day in town to ask Harlan Voss, who apparently owned a share of it, whether he would stop sending his ranch hands onto the south end of the creek road, which was her access road, and which they had been using to cut to the grazing land without her permission. She told him this clearly, in front of several witnesses, without raising her voice. "You are welcome to use that road," she said to Harlan, who was sitting at a table with a glass of whiskey and an expression that suggested he had not expected the afternoon to go this direction. "If you ask me first and we agree to terms. You are not welcome to use it as though it is yours. It is not yours. I would like that to stop." The saloon was very quiet. "Terms," Harlan repeated, in the tone of a man trying to locate the thread of a conversation that has gone somewhere unexpected. "Yes." "Terms, road usage in exchange for something of equivalent value. That is how arrangements work." She left. The saloon stayed quiet for a long moment after she did. "Who is she?" someone said. Nobody had a fully satisfying answer. The person who heard the most about Della Hayes in those early weeks was Wallace Merritt, because in a small town, news travels to the people it is relevant to, and Wallace was relevant to this particular news by virtue of being her nearest neighbor. He heard about the land office. He heard about Harlan Voss and the road. He heard that she had informed the minister, politely but without apology, that she would not be joining the Ladies' Aid Society because she did not have the time, though she appreciated the invitation, and had then donated $1 to the church repair fund, which was more than most of the Ladies' Aid Society members had managed that month. He heard all of this, and he was not surprised by any of it. He had met her. He had looked at the way she held herself when she was working the digging bar, not performing effort, just applying it. He had heard the way she asked questions, which was the way of a person who genuinely wanted the answers. He was 30 years old, and he had come to Caldwell from Missouri 6 years ago, and he had built his ranch from a small piece of good land by working it steadily and refusing to do anything that did not make sense. He had no patience for performance of any kind, which had made him a good rancher and a somewhat solitary man. He had friends. He was liked in the way that quiet, reliable men are liked in small towns, with a steadiness that the community leans on without always noticing it is there. But he had not, in 6 years, found a person whose company he preferred to his own. He found himself thinking about Della Hayes more than he had any obvious reason to. He thought about it objectively the way he thought about most things. She was his neighbor. She was new to the area and the work. She had a farm to establish, and he knew this land better than she did. It was neighborly to offer help when it was useful. He thought he believed this. He was not quite certain. 3 weeks after he left the digging bar, he came back to retrieve it on a Sunday afternoon. The fence was properly repaired. The garden bed had been cleared and turned, dark soil gleaming in the late summer sun, with rows already planted. The cabin door was open, and from inside came the sound of someone moving around with purpose. He knocked on the door frame. "Come in," Della said from inside, and he stepped into the dim cool of the cabin. She was at the table with a ledger open in front of her and an ink-stained pen in her hand, and she looked up at him with the focused expression of someone being interrupted in the middle of a calculation. It shifted, not into social pleasantness, but into genuine recognition. A small adjustment. "Mr. Merritt," she said. "I left the digging bar on the south side of the cabin. The soil out there needs breaking up before I plant the fall crop, and I wanted to use it once more." "Take your time," he said. "I came by to see how the fence held." "Come and look," she said, already standing. They went out, and she showed him where the post was seated, solid now, the rail level. She had done the whole fence line, he noticed, not just the one bad section. Every post had been checked and re-driven where it needed it. "You did the whole thing," he said. "While I was at it," she said simply. He looked at the garden. "You planted already. Turnips, carrots, late beets. The almanac says there are 6 weeks before the first frost risk. That should be enough for a root crop." She glanced at him. "Does that seem right to you, with this particular latitude?" He thought about it honestly. "Might be closer to 5 weeks if we get an early cold snap, which we do sometimes. September can fool you." "Then I should have planted a week ago," she said, not distressed by this, just noting it. "You did not have a week ago. You had now." She looked at him again with that direct, considering gaze. That is a reasonable way to think about it. He stayed for coffee, which she made on the stove while they talked about the creek's water level in late summer and the best places to fish for channel catfish, which he brought up because he had noticed a fishing line among her father's things near the cabin door and thought she might find the information useful. She had noticed it too and had already tried fishing the East Bend without success, and he told her the East Bend was too shallow by August, and the catfish moved to the deeper hole further south, and she listened with the attention she gave everything useful. There was a moment while they were sitting at the table with their coffee cups when the conversation paused, not in the uncomfortable way of pauses between strangers, but in the comfortable way of pauses between people who have run out of the immediately practical and are resting before finding what comes next. The afternoon light was coming through the window at an angle that made the interior of the cabin glow amber, and Della was looking at her ledger with an expression that was thoughtful rather than anxious, and Wallace was looking at his coffee cup and thinking that this was an unusually pleasant way to spend a Sunday afternoon. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Why here? There must have been easier places to go." Della was quiet for a moment, and it was the quiet of someone deciding how honest to be, and then deciding that honesty was the thing she was committed to, so there was really no decision to make. "My father came here because he was running away," she said. "I know that is not a kind thing to say about a person you love, but it is true. He was running away from my mother's death and from Virginia and from everything that reminded him of her. And then he found this place and he stopped running because the place was beautiful enough to make him stay." She looked up at Wallace. "I came here because it is beautiful, because the land is good and it is mine, and I have wanted something that was purely mine for a long time. I am not running from anything. I am running toward this." Wallace looked at her steadily. "That seems like the right reason," he said. "What was your reason," she asked, "for coming here?" "Similar," he said, "minus the running away. I had a small amount of money and I wanted land, and Missouri was spoken for in every direction worth speaking for. I came west because there was room to do what I wanted to do, which is raise cattle and have enough space that my nearest neighbor is not a source of daily irritation." Della smiled at this, a real smile, quick and warm. "And am I a source of daily irritation?" "You are 3 miles away," he said. "So far, no." She laughed, a short, genuine sound. "I will try to maintain the distance." He rode home that evening with the digging bar across his pack horse, and a feeling he recognized as something he had not felt in a while, which was interest. Genuine, uncomplicated interest in a person. Not the polite interest of social courtesy or the tired interest of loneliness, but the real kind, the kind that makes you find yourself recalling the exact thing someone said and the exact way they looked when they said it. He recalled the way she said, "I am running toward this." The certainty of it. Harlan Voss was a problem that did not go away simply because Della had addressed it directly. He was a man who had too much money and too little opposition, a combination that produced in him the particular kind of stubbornness that is not really stubbornness at all, but simply the lifelong assumption that things will eventually arrange themselves to his preference if he waits long enough. His family's ranch, the Comstock, was the largest operation in the area, and Harlan had grown up understanding that his size translated to precedence in most matters. He wanted the South Access Road. He also, in the way of men who had not thought about it clearly, wanted the 40 acres on the South Fork, which were better watered than any of his land and which his father had tried to purchase from Edmund Hayes twice without success. Harlan had no specific plan. He had an inclination, and he was the kind of man who mistook inclination for direction. He began showing up at Della's fence line, not crossing it, not threatening, just appearing on the road, stopping, watching her work. His ranch hands used the road twice more without her permission. He sent a man around with an offer to buy the property, which was below market value, which she declined without drama. He came to the cabin door himself one afternoon in early September when the air had started to carry the first edge of autumn in the mornings, and he stood on her step with his hat in his hand and a manner that was trying for charm and missing it. "Miss Hayes," he said, "I wonder if you might reconsider the offer on the property. I have been authorized to go higher." "No," Della said. "It is a lot of work for one person," she said. "Yes, I know. I am doing it." "The answer is no, Mr. Voss. This land belonged to my father, and it belongs to me, and it will belong to whoever I choose to leave it to when my time comes. I am not interested in selling it. I will not be interested in selling it regardless of how many times you ask or how much you offer." Harlan Voss put his hat back on. Something in his face shifted, not to anger exactly, but to the cold consideration of a man who has decided that a pleasant approach has failed and is now consulting the inventory of other approaches. "You are going to find it hard going," he said, "out here alone." "I expect so," Della said. "Most good things are hard. Good day, Mr. Voss." She closed the cabin door with a sound that was not quite a slam but was not soft either. She stood in the cabin for a moment after he left, and she was honest with herself, because she was always honest with herself. She was not afraid exactly, but she was aware that in this particular town, in this particular year, a woman alone on 40 acres with a man like Harlan Voss interested in the land was a situation that required more than clarity of purpose. It required other things: community, relationships, people who would notice if something went wrong. She made a mental list, which was what she did when she was thinking through problems. She wrote it in the ledger: church, general store, Pete Haverson. Wallace Merritt. She put Wallace Merritt last on the list, but she was aware she had written the name quickly. The next Saturday she went to town and bought what she needed, and while she was loading the wagon she hired from Pete's cousin, she saw Wallace Merritt outside the land office, speaking with Gerald Cobb about something that Gerald Cobb was clearly reluctant to confirm. Wallace had the patient expression of a man who will simply stand there and repeat himself until the answer is the correct one. When Cobb finally went back inside, Wallace turned and saw her. He crossed the street. "You look like someone calculating something," he said. "I am always calculating something," she said. "Harlan Voss came to the cabin yesterday." Wallace's expression did not change much, but something in it settled. "What did he want?" "He wants to buy the land. He implied that I would have difficulty managing alone." "He implies that to a lot of people," Wallace said. "He implied it to me when I was setting up my ranch. He does not like competition for water access." "Is he dangerous?" Wallace thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. "He is the kind of man who has always gotten what he wanted through persistence and small pressures. I have not seen him resort to outright harm, but I have not seen him go without something he wanted this consistently either." Della considered this. "I am not going to leave," she said. "I did not think you were," Wallace said. "I was going to say if you are amenable I ride that creek road most weeks. I can make it a regular thing." She looked at him. He looked back. There was nothing in his face that resembled pity, which was what she had been bracing for without quite knowing it. There was only the same practical attention he had brought to the fence post and the soil. "That would be useful," she said. "Thank you." He nodded. He helped her lift the heavier sack of flour into the wagon bed. Not because she could not do it, but because he was standing there, and it was faster with two people. And she accepted this without making anything of it either way. October came in on a cold wind from the north, and the cottonwoods along Bluff Creek turned gold overnight like someone had lit them from the inside. Della had gotten her root vegetables in, harvested most of what the garden would give in its first season, which was less than it would give in future seasons once the soil was truly worked in. She had put up preserves, dried herbs, laid in enough wood for the winter with the help of Pete Haverson and his nephew, who she paid fairly and in cash. The cabin was warmer than she had expected. Her father had chinked it well, and she rechunked it where the mortar had shrunk over the summer, filling every gap. When she lit the stove in the morning, the whole small interior reached a comfortable temperature within an hour and held it. She had begun to love this place in the way you love things that are difficult and entirely yours. She loved the sound of the creek on cold mornings, the way the water moved under a skim of ice at the edges and flowed dark and quick in the center. She loved the quality of the light in autumn, the way it came in low and golden, and made even the bare fields look like something painted with intention. She loved that, when she went to bed at night, every aching part of her had ached for her own reasons. Wallace Merritt came by most weeks, and their arrangement had evolved without either of them formally acknowledging the evolution. He no longer came by to deliver or retrieve tools. He came because he came, and she made coffee, and they sat at the table and talked. Sometimes they walked the land together, and he showed her things she had not noticed, where the ground water sat close to the surface in spring, which corner of the south field drained worst, where the deer trails ran that would tell her which direction the wind was coming from before a storm. She showed him things, too, in the way of someone who sees differently than the people who have always been there, the particular mix of wildflowers in the East Meadow, which she had identified from her botanical book, and which she told him were not common to this region, and suggested something about the drainage pattern. He listened to everything she said with the same quality of attention she gave to everything he said. They had found, without searching for it, a kind of conversation that was two people thinking out loud together, which is the rarest and most satisfying kind. What they did not say, for a long time, was the other thing. The thing that existed in the way he paused after knocking on her door frame and waited for her face to appear before he fully relaxed. The thing that existed in the way she found herself noting, when she was working in the garden and heard hoofbeats on the creek road, whether they had the rhythm of his horse. It existed in the pause of Sunday afternoons and the quality of coffee that tasted different depending on whose company you drank it in. They did not say it because they were both careful people, and careful people do not say things until they are sure of them. November brought the first real snow, a shallow early snow that lasted 3 days and then melted into mud. It also brought something else, which was Harlan Voss's next move. She found it on a Monday morning, which was 3 days after she had last seen anyone from town. The north fence of her property had been pulled down, the posts pulled from the ground, 2 rails broken. On the other side of the broken fence, there were cattle, about 30 head of Comstock stock, standing in her winter grazing ground, eating what she had left standing for the 2 milk cows she was planning to acquire in spring. Della stood at the edge of it in the cold morning air and looked at the damage with a stillness that was not calm exactly, but was the thing that exists just before the decision about how to respond. Then she turned around, walked back to the cabin, put on her coat, saddled the horse she had recently purchased from Pete Haverson's cousin, and rode to town. She went to the sheriff's office first. The sheriff was a man named Orrin Baxter, 51 years old, gray-bearded, and with the resigned look of a man who had spent decades mediating between the competing interests of cattle money and the law. He listened to her account of the downed fence and the Comstock cattle. He wrote things down in a ledger. "I will send someone out to assess the damage," he said. "These things can be hard to prove, Miss Hayes. Fence posts come down in weather." "The posts were pulled from the ground," Della said. "If they had fallen from weather, the soil disturbance would look different. I can show you what the hole looks like." Baxter looked at her with the expression of a man who has not been expected to actually think about something in some time. "I will come out myself," he said, which was more than she had expected. "Thank you," she said. She left and went across the street to the general store, because she needed to order 2 replacement rails and could not afford to wait on that regardless of what the sheriff did or did not do. She was coming out of the general store when she nearly walked into Wallace Merritt, who was coming in from the other direction with the particular urgency of a man who had somewhere to be and then saw her face and changed his plan. "What happened?" he said. It was not a question exactly. He had read it in her face or her posture or in some quality of her movement. She told him. He listened without interrupting. "I'm coming out to look at it," he said. "Sheriff Baxter said he would come." "Baxter is slow and Voss is fast. I am coming out today." He paused, "If that is all right with you." "It is all right with me," she said. "He came out that afternoon." He looked at the pulled posts, the broken rails, the hoof-churned ground. He drove Comstock cattle off her land himself, which involved some noise and effort and his roan horse doing its job in the calm, competent way that a good cow horse does. He looked at the fence posts in the holes and confirmed what she had said. The soil disturbance pattern was wrong for weather damage. The posts had been pulled by hand or with a chain. "He's escalating," Wallace said. "I know," Della said. "If Baxter doesn't act on this, you'll need other options." "What other options?" He thought about it. "The other ranchers in the area, most of them are not friends of Voss. He has pushed people around before. If there is a general complaint, it carries more weight than an individual one." "You are one of those ranchers," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment in the cold afternoon air, the creek moving behind them, the bare cottonwood branches making their fine dark lines against the sky. Her face was serious and direct, and he had learned to read the layers in that directness, the thinking happening underneath, the precision of what she was feeling and what she chose to say. "Why are you helping me?" She said. He held her gaze. "Because it is the right thing to do." "That is not all of it," she said. He was quiet for a moment, a careful man. But she had asked directly, and she had always found with him that a direct question met its match. "No," he said, "it is not all of it." The air between them held something that had been accumulating for weeks. She was looking at him the way she looked at things that were real and true, with her whole attention, without flinching. "I am going to stay on this land," she said. "I want you to know that. I'm not someone you need to protect. I can manage my own difficulties." "I know that," he said. "But I think I would like you to be around while I am managing them." Something shifted in his face, very small but entirely unguarded. "I would like that too," he said. They stood there in the cold among the pulled fence posts and the hoof-churned mud, and it was not a romantic setting by any conventional measure, and neither of them moved to close the distance between them, because they were both careful people, and this was the beginning of something they were taking seriously. But something had been said. Something that had been growing in the space between Sunday coffee cups and Creek Road conversations had been named, quietly and without fanfare, in the way that real things are named rather than performed things. Sheriff Baxter came the following day. He looked at the posts, agreed that the disturbance pattern was unusual, and said he would speak to the Comstock Ranch about keeping their cattle off Hayes' land. He did not commit to more than that. But the speaking, apparently, was something, because the Comstock cattle did not come back. What came instead, 2 weeks later, was a formal offer from Harlan Voss's lawyer, a man from Wichita who rode out on a Tuesday with papers drawn up that attempted to claim a grazing easement on the south portion of the Hayes land, based on a document that purported to show the land had been used for Comstock cattle grazing before Edmund Hayes filed the original claim. Della read the document carefully. She read it 3 times. Then she set it down on the table and looked at the lawyer from Wichita, a man named Lester Pratt, who had the careful, watchful eyes of someone who was very good at his job and not always good to the people he did his job around. "This document," she said, "is dated 1873. My father filed his homestead claim in 1874. If Comstock cattle were grazing this land in 1873, it was open range, which means anyone's cattle could graze it, which means there is no exclusive easement established. Furthermore, this document has no official filing stamp. It was not recorded with the Territory Land Office." Lester Pratt looked at her. His expression did not change, but his eyes recalibrated. "I would need to verify the filing history," he said carefully. "I have already done so," Della said. "I have the full record of every document filed regarding this parcel of land since 1870. Would you like to see them?" He would, it turned out. And when he saw them, and when he understood that she had not only read and understood them but had written to the Wichita Territorial Land Records Office and obtained confirmation of what was and was not on file, Lester Pratt put his papers back in his satchel and said he would report back to his client. Harlan Voss, apparently, received this report with frustration. The report that reached Wallace Merritt, through the general social circulation of a small town, was that Voss had thrown something. But throwing things did not produce easements, and after a cold December and a quiet January, the trouble from the Comstock Ranch subsided to the level of sour looks and deliberate social exclusion from certain circles. Della did not mind exclusion from circles that had never actually welcomed her. Christmas came, quiet and cold, and the creek fully frozen for the first time since she had arrived. She had been in Kansas for 5 months. She had a solid fence line, a working kitchen garden planned for spring, 40 acres of land that was entirely hers, 2 agreements in place with other ranchers in the area regarding the purchase of a milk cow and a small number of laying hens, and a neighbor who rode the creek road most weeks and sat at her table most Sundays. She and Wallace had not kissed. They had not formally called whatever was between them anything. But they had built something that had the quality of real things, which is that it did not require constant articulation to continue existing. It simply was. It lived in the particular warmth of a room when he was in it, and in the fact that she found herself laughing more often than she had in years, and in the fact that he had told her, on a gray November day while they were stacking cord wood, that she was the most interesting person he had met in Kansas, and she had said he was the most useful person she had met in Kansas, and he had laughed in the real, unguarded way that she had come to understand was his best thing. On Christmas Day she rode to his ranch, because she had made him a fruit cake from a recipe she had adapted from her mother's notes, using what was available rather than what was traditional, and because she had been invited, and because it was Christmas and she found she did not want to be alone for it. His ranch was 3 miles east and it was a good operation, she saw immediately. The buildings were solid and well-maintained. The cattle visible in the winter pasture looked healthy, and the main house, which was larger than her cabin by 2 rooms, had the organized, practical look of a place run by someone who thought clearly. There was a dog, a large brown and white animal named Prospect, who came to meet her horse with the formal enthusiasm of a creature who took his responsibilities very seriously. Wallace met her at the gate. He had made dinner. This surprised her more than almost anything else so far, because it was a real dinner, venison stew with root vegetables and a pan of cornbread, and he had set the table with plates that were not the tin ones he used for daily meals. She looked at the table and then at him. "I can cook," he said, with the neutrality of someone stating a fact. "I can see that," she said. They ate and they talked, and the afternoon light moved across the room, and outside the wind picked up and neither of them noticed particularly. Prospect slept by the stove. The stew was good and the cornbread was good and the fruit cake, she decided, was better than she had expected given the adaptations. After they had cleared the table and she was sitting in the chair near the window with a cup of coffee and watching the last of the December light leave the sky, she said, "I have been thinking about what I want this place to be. The farm. Long term. Tell me," he said. He sat across from her with his own cup, his legs stretched out, comfortable in the way of a man in his own house who has also become comfortable with who is in it. "I want a proper kitchen garden, which I am starting in earnest in spring. I want to expand the grazing ground on the north section, which means improving the fence line over there. I want 2 milk cows and a better system for the water from the creek, a channel or at least a piped draw for the garden. I want eventually to grow enough in the garden to sell at the Saturday market in town. The Saturday market is mostly vegetables and eggs right now," he said. "There is room in it. I know, I have looked at it." He smiled at her, that quiet, genuine smile. "You have looked at everything. That is how I make sure things work," she said. He set his cup down and looked at her directly, the way he had looked at her that November afternoon with the pulled fence posts around them. "Della," he said. She looked back at him. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you are willing," the word properly. She felt something in her chest that was warm and real because he had said it exactly that way, not assuming, not performing, just asking. Clearly, as clearly as she asked everything. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He smiled again, a wider one this time, and it changed his whole face in the best way, and she thought, looking at him in the last of the Christmas light with Prospect snoring by the stove, that she had made some very good decisions in the past year. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was not a mild one. The Kansas plains produced several significant snowstorms in January, the kind that kept everyone close to home and reminded the territory that it was not, despite the summer heat, a gentle landscape. Della kept her cattle off her land, meaning the 2 cows she had now acquired, safe in the small barn she had reinforced with boards bought in town. She kept wood enough for the stove. She read her books and wrote letters to the one friend she had left in Richmond, a woman named Clara who wrote back with the news of Virginia in the fond, slightly disbelieving tone of someone who could not quite picture where Della was now. She could picture it very clearly. She was in it. Wallace checked on her after each significant storm, which she appreciated not because she was in danger, but because it was evidence of genuine care as opposed to the performed kind. He came through the snow on his roan horse that handled weather with the same equanimity it handled everything else, and they drank coffee and he helped with whatever needed 2 people rather than 1, and he left before dark because she did not need the town to have material for gossip, and he was careful about her reputation, even though she had not asked him to be. She had noticed that. His care for things she had not explicitly requested, but would have asked for if she had thought to. In February, she told him so. They were walking the creek line on a cold, bright day, checking where the bank had eroded over the winter floods, and she said, without preamble, "You are careful with my reputation in a way I did not have to ask for." He looked at her sideways. "Should I not be?" "You should. I am noting that you are without having been asked." He was quiet for a moment, walking. "My mother raised me to consider things from the other person's position," he said. "Your position in this town requires careful management. You are a woman alone on land that a powerful man would like to take. Your reputation is part of your ability to hold that position." "That is exactly right," she said. "Most people who see that see it because they have been told to. You just saw it." He looked at her. "You give me too much credit." "I give you precisely the credit you have earned," she said, which was the most honest thing she could say, and also, she realized as she said it, something approaching a declaration. He stopped walking. She stopped because he did. The creek was moving beside them, the ice mostly gone now, the water running clear and cold over the rocks. "Della," he said. "Yes, I am in love with you." She looked at him for a long moment, and the moment was the good kind, the kind that is not tense but full, the way good things feel when you are standing right in the center of them. "I know," she said. "I am in love with you too." He laughed, a real one. "You could not simply say it first. You said it first. You knew it first." "I also knew you would get there," she said. "I was giving you time." He took her hand. This was the first time he had taken her hand. And it was exactly right in every way a thing can be exactly right. His hand was warm and work-roughened and certain, and hers was the same, and they stood by the winter-cold creek in the February light, and there was nothing tentative about it. He kissed her, carefully and with full intention, which was how he did most things, and she kissed him back with equal intention, and it was the kind of kiss that does not immediately lead anywhere except to being more completely in the moment, and the moment was sufficient. Spring came to the South Fork of Bluff Creek with a thoroughness that made Della understand for the first time why her father had described it the way he had in his letters. Everything came up at once, the ground thawing and the creek running high and the prairie grass going green from one day to the next in a way that felt like a decision. She put her kitchen garden in with a thoroughness she had been planning since November, organized into beds with paths between them, planted in succession so that things would come in over a spread of weeks rather than all at once. She bought 2 more laying hens, bringing her flock to 5. She arranged for the milk cows to use the north pasture in rotation with her planned kitchen garden space, which required some fence adjustment that she and Wallace did together on a Saturday in April, working their way along the line in the warm morning sun, driving posts and stretching wire. The Saturday market in Caldwell started in May. She brought her first vegetables in June, early summer crops, radishes and lettuces and the first beans, laid out on a clean cloth on a table she had borrowed from Arthur Finch's general store. She sold everything within 2 hours. The woman next to her at the market, a rancher's wife named Bessie Tallow who was selling eggs and dried herbs, watched this happen and then looked at Della with new consideration. "You grew all that on Hayes' land," she said. "Yes," Della said. "Edmund never grew anything much there." "Edmund was not a gardener," Della said. "I am." Bessie Tallow had been one of the women who found Della strange. She reassessed this over the next few weeks as Della continued to appear at market with more and more produce, and to sell it with the steady, organized efficiency of someone who had thought carefully about presentation and volume and price. By July, Bessie Tallow was recommending Della's vegetables to her friends, and by August they were having coffee together occasionally, which was not a friendship exactly but was something approaching it. The town's opinion of Della Hayes had shifted, slowly and unevenly, in the way that small-town opinions shift, which is through accumulated evidence. She was not going to fail. She was not going to leave. She was not going to adjust herself to fit the available space. And because none of those things happened, the space itself had begun, almost imperceptibly, to adjust. Harlan Voss remained unfriendly. He had moved on to being the kind of unfriendly that does not involve active interference, which was the best she could expect from him and was enough. The sheriff had spoken to him. Other ranchers in the area, through conversations that Wallace had facilitated carefully and without drama, had made it known that interference with a legal homestead claim was not something they would overlook. The collective weight of that had settled things. Harlan still looked at her land with longing when he rode past, but looking was not taking, and Della could manage being looked at. In July, Wallace took her to see something on his land that he had not shown her before, a section along the north fork of the creek where the prairie opened into a wide meadow sheltered on 3 sides by a gentle rise of land, with a view to the west that at sunset was extraordinary. He had been thinking, he said, about whether to build there or to extend the existing house. She looked at the meadow and the view and the sheltered quality of the land. "Build here," she said. He looked at her. "I was thinking the same thing." She looked back at him. They were both thinking the same larger thing and had been for some time, and she could see that he knew she was thinking it, and she knew he was thinking it, and neither of them had said it yet in the most important way. "Wallace," she said. "Yes." "Marry me," she said. He stared at her for a moment. Then a smile broke across his face that she had never seen before, wider than usual, startled and delighted at once. "I was supposed to ask you," he said. "You were taking your time," she said. "I gave you time in February. It is now July." "I was planning to ask," he said. "I know I have beaten you to it." "Della Hayes," he said, "will you give me the opportunity to actually ask?" She gestured magnanimously with one hand. "Go ahead." He laughed, and then he was serious for a moment, looking at her in the meadow with the July sun warm on them and the creek sound coming from the north, and his face had the unguarded quality that she had come to understand was the truest thing about him. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Will you let me be your partner in this? Will you let me be the person you tell everything to and the person who listens like you deserve to be listened to? Will you marry me, Della?" She felt something so full and right that she stood in it for a moment before answering. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He kissed her in the meadow in July, with the sun going west and the grass tall around them and the creek singing somewhere nearby. And this time the kiss had a different quality than February's, because February had been the beginning of something and July was the deep middle of it, warm and sure, and built on months of real knowing. They were married in September, in the half-finished church in Caldwell, which had acquired a proper roof since Della's arrival. partly through general fund donations, and partly through a pointed conversation she had had with the minister about how a roof might serve the congregation better than several other current priorities. The minister had agreed, somewhat to his own surprise. The wedding was not large. It was not small either. Bessie Tallow came and sat in the front pew and looked pleased with herself for having had good judgment about Della eventually. Pete Haverson came because Pete Haverson was a man who believed in showing up for things. Arthur Finch came from the general store. The other ranchers whose goodwill Wallace had cultivated came with their wives, and there was a moment before the ceremony started when Della looked out from the side door of the church at the assembled people, and felt something she had not expected to feel, which was that this place, this dry, wide, difficult, beautiful place, had become hers in more ways than the legal 40 acres. Her father would have been glad to know it. She walked up the aisle of that church without anyone to give her away, because she had given herself here and that was the beginning of everything, and she walked with the same directness she brought to every other thing in her life. And when she reached Wallace at the front, he looked at her the way he had looked at her in the meadow, with the whole of his attention and the whole of his honesty, and she understood that this was what she had been moving toward all along. They said their vows. They were simple and direct, because they were both simple and direct people, and when they were said, they were meant in every syllable. The minister pronounced them married, and the small gathered congregation made a cheerful noise, and Prospect the dog, who had been sitting by the church steps and was theoretically not inside, leaned his head through the open door with the expression of a dog who felt he deserved some credit for how well this had gone. The winter of their first year as Wallace and Della Merritt was a building winter. The house in the meadow was begun in October, framed by Wallace and 2 men he hired from town, with Della involved in every decision about layout and light and storage space, which led to a design that used the site better than the original plan had. The south-facing windows were her idea. The large pantry off the kitchen was hers. The extra room in the rear, the one Wallace had planned for storage, became, through a conversation in November, the nursery, which was a conversation that led to another conversation, which was a very good conversation. They continued living in Wallace's existing house through the construction, which meant that Della was back and forth to her own cabin regularly, because the kitchen garden did not stop requiring attention simply because she had gotten married, and because her milk cows required care, and because she was not the kind of person who set things down simply because her circumstances had changed. She negotiated with Wallace about the land, because she was serious about the land and she needed him to understand what it meant to her. They sat down at the table in his house on a November evening, the stove going, Prospect at their feet, and she laid it out clearly. "The Hayes land is mine," she said. "I want it to remain in my name. I want us to farm it as part of the overall operation, but I want the deed to remain as it is." Wallace looked at her without surprise. "I expected you to say that." And it makes sense," he said. "It is your land, it was your father's land, it will be yours." "I want our children to inherit it," she said, "alongside the Merritt land." He nodded. "That seems right. Then we are agreed." "We are agreed," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and the directness between them was, as it always was, a kind of intimacy more complete than most people achieve. "You are very easy to be married to," she said. "You expected otherwise." "I did not know what to expect," she said honestly. "I knew what I wanted. I was not certain it existed." "You did an unusual amount of work to find it," he said. "I came to Kansas," she said. "That is an unusual amount of work." He smiled at her across the November table. "It was worth it," he said. "From my side of the table it was absolutely worth it." Spring came again, and with it, the completion of the new house in the meadow. It was finished in April, and they moved into it on a Sunday in the first warm week, carrying their things from the old house with the help of Pete Haverson's wagon. The new house smelled of fresh lumber and plaster, and the river stone fireplace that Wallace had laid himself over the course of several winter Saturdays with the help of a craftsman from Caldwell named Ruiz, who did stone work with an artistry that made the fireplace the finest thing in the house. Della hung her mother's one painting above it, a small landscape of a Virginia River valley, which looked strange and beautiful in a Kansas room, and which she had carried in her trunk all the way from Richmond for exactly this reason. The kitchen garden at the Hayes cabin continued through the season, tended now partly by Della and partly by a young woman named Maggie Sorrell, 17 years old, and the daughter of a dry goods merchant who had come west with her family the previous year, and was looking for work that was not entirely domestic. Della paid her fairly and taught her everything she knew about the garden in the straightforward way she had always done things, with information given clearly, and trust extended in proportion to demonstrated competence. Maggie was a good learner. By midsummer, she was managing the garden largely on her own, and Della was spending more of her time on the combined operation of the two pieces of land, which she and Wallace had begun to think of as the Merritt and Hayes spread, with no contraction of either name. In June of 1880, Della discovered she was expecting a child. She told Wallace on a Tuesday evening after dinner, sitting at the table in the new house with the last of the day's light coming through the south-facing windows that had been her idea, the light falling warm and golden across the room. "I believe we are going to have a child," she said. Wallace went very still for a moment, the kind of still that happens when something large and true lands inside you. Then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, which was complete and uncomplicated joy. "When?" he said. "February, I think, perhaps January." He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat like that in the evening light for a while, and it was one of those moments that is quiet from the outside and enormous from the inside. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Yes," he said, "a little." "Good," she said. "That means we are taking it seriously." He laughed. She laughed too. Prospect looked up from his place by the stove with the expression of a dog who was not yet sure what was happening, but was prepared to be supportive. The pregnancy was not an easy one in its early months, which she managed with the same practical directness she brought to difficult things. She found a midwife in Caldwell named Mrs. Clara Reed, a woman of 50 who had delivered more babies in this territory than anyone else, and who had the calm, experienced manner of someone who has seen everything go both ways and has organized all of that experience into very useful knowledge. Della and Mrs. Reed got along very well. She kept the garden going through the summer, with more reliance on Maggie as the pregnancy progressed, and the heat of July made heavy work genuinely unwise. She kept the accounts and the ledger and the market planning. She kept the conversations with Wallace in the evenings, the thinking aloud together kind, which now included a new subject, which was the child and who they might be and what sort of world they were bringing them into. "It's a hard world," Della said, on an August evening when they were sitting on the porch of the new house watching the prairie sky go through its sunset colors, which were extraordinary and changed every night and never got ordinary no matter how many times you watched. "It is," Wallace agreed. "But it is also this," she said, meaning the sky and the meadow and the creek and the distance. "Yes," he said, "it is also this." She leaned against him in the particular way that had developed over the past year, her head against his shoulder, his arm around her, both of them looking outward at the same thing. It was a good configuration. It had taken no effort to discover. It was simply where they fit. Their son was born on the 23rd of January, 1881, on a night when the temperature outside the new house dropped to a degree that made the window glass fog and the stove work hard. Mrs. Reed was there, efficient and calm. Wallace was there, which was her requirement, stated early and non-negotiable, and he had sat by the bed through the long hours of it, holding her hand and not trying to make anything easier that could not be made easier, which was the right thing to do, and which she told him so afterward. The baby was healthy and loud, and when she first held him, looked up at her with the unfocused, serious expression of a person who is encountering the world for the first time and reserving judgment. "He looks like he is making a decision about something," Wallace said, looking at his son. "He probably is," Della said. "They named him Edmund Wallace Merritt. Edmund for her father, Wallace for his." He was a compact, strong baby who grew into a compact, strong boy. And by the time he was 6 months old, he had made his preferences entirely clear regarding feeding times and sleep arrangements, and the proximity of the dog, all of which were accommodated because the household of Della and Wallace Merritt was one in which preferences, stated clearly, were taken seriously regardless of the size of the person stating them. The town of Caldwell continued to exist around them, and the years began to move in the way that good years move, which is with sufficient texture and incident to keep them distinct, but with an underlying quality that is steady and constructive rather than anxious. The Saturday market expanded. The church was fully finished. A school was established, which Della had a hand in, having written a letter to the county education board that was, by all accounts, comprehensive in its argument and difficult to dismiss. In the spring of 1882, there was a drought that reduced the creek water level significantly and created a hard season for everyone who farmed or ranched near it. Della managed this with careful water rationing in the kitchen garden and a shift in her crop plan toward more drought-tolerant varieties, which she researched in every agricultural publication she could get her hands on through the Wichita Post. Wallace managed it on the cattle side by selling down his herd to a sustainable number for the available water and grass, which was a painful short-term decision and a sound long-term one. They managed the drought together in the literal sense, meaning they worked through every decision together at the kitchen table in the evenings. With the ledgers and the almanac and the water measurements Della had been taking at the creek every week since her arrival, which now constituted 4 years of data, and were more useful than anything else in understanding how bad this drought actually was relative to other low-water years. "You have been measuring the creek for 4 years, Wallace said one evening, looking at her records. "I started the week I arrived," she said. "I wanted to understand the land." He looked at her with the expression that had, over 4 years and a marriage and a child, lost none of its quality. He still looked at her that way, with the whole of his attention and the genuineness of a man who finds the person he is looking at continually interesting. "I want to say something," he said. "Say it." "In 4 years of knowing you, I have not once found you predictable. I have not once known what you were going to do next, except that it was going to be exact and considered and right. And I want to say clearly that this is the best thing about being married to you, and I think about it most mornings." Della looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight, with their son asleep in the nursery and Prospect at their feet, and 4 years of creek measurements laid out between them. "You are very good at saying things clearly when you decide to say them," she said. "I learned that from someone," he said. She smiled at him, the real, quick, warm smile that he had loved since the first time he had seen it, that day in September of 1878, when she had made a small joke about maintaining the 3-mile distance. "I love you," she said, in the same tone she would have used to state any true thing. "I love you too," he said, in exactly the same tone, which was the right tone, because love between people who mean it fully is not a performance but a fact, and facts deserve to be stated plainly. The drought broke in August with 3 weeks of steady rain that brought the creek back up and turned the dusty pastures green again in the improbable way the Kansas plains could do. The garden, which had been reduced to its most drought-resistant essentials, came back strong in September, and Della planted a full fall crop that recovered more of the season than she had expected to. In October of 1882, she realized she was expecting their second child. This pregnancy was easier than the first. She was stronger, she knew more, and Mrs. Reed had that calm competence that was, by now, as familiar and reassuring as anything in her life. The baby came in June of 1883, a daughter, born on a warm summer morning with the sound of the creek carrying through the open windows of the house. They named her Clara Rose Merritt. Clara for the friend in Virginia who had written every month for 5 years, and who had, upon receiving the letter describing Wallace Merritt, written back 3 pages of commentary that made Della laugh aloud twice. Rose because there was a wild rose bush that grew on the south side of the new house that bloomed every June in a color that Della had never found a name for, somewhere between pink and copper, and which seemed like something a person ought to name a child after if they were going to name a child in June. Clara Rose was a large, healthy, good-natured baby who became a large, healthy, good-natured child, with Wallace's coloring and Della's disposition toward clear preferences stated without apology. She was adored by her brother, who was now 2.5 and had opinions about everything, and by Prospect, who had taken on the role of guardian with the seriousness of a creature who understood this was his most important work. The summer of 1883 was a good one. The creek ran full, the garden was the best it had been since Della had arrived, and the combined operation of the Merritt and Hayes land was showing the kind of steady, real profit that comes not from luck but from consistent, intelligent work over multiple seasons. Wallace's cattle herd was rebuilt and healthy. The Saturday market in Caldwell had a permanent spot with Della's name on the list, and Maggie Sorrell, now 19 and managing the Hayes garden largely independently, had grown into someone who talked about the soil the way Della had taught her to, with respect and precision. Harlan Voss had sold the Comstock Ranch in 1882 to a corporation out of Kansas City, citing poor returns, which several people in the area suspected was more about the sustained pressure of not getting what he wanted than about actual poor returns. The new owners were less interesting in the South Fork land and more interested in the trail money, and they left the Hayes and Merritt operation entirely alone. Della noted the sale in her ledger without comment and moved on. One afternoon in the fall of 1883, Della was in the kitchen garden of the Hayes cabin, which she visited weekly to check on Maggie's work and to do the things she preferred to do herself, tending the herb section that she had expanded into a significant collection, documenting which varieties did well in the Kansas climate and which struggled. She was making notes in a small book, crouched between the lavender and the sage, when she heard hoofbeats and looked up. Wallace was coming along the creek road with Edmund on the saddle in front of him, which was their Saturday arrangement when she was at the cabin. He would bring their son to find her, and they would ride home together. Edmund, at 2 3/4, was extremely confident on horseback in the limited capacity his father allowed him, which was to sit forward of the saddle horn and believe himself in full charge of the horse. She stood up and brushed dirt from her knees and watched them come. This view, this specific thing, her husband and her son on a roan horse on the creek road in the autumn, with the cottonwoods going gold behind them and the garden full, and the cabin of her father's making solid in the corner of her eye. This was a view she had not known she was looking for when she stepped off a stagecoach 5 years ago with one trunk and a carpet bag, and a clarity of purpose that everyone who encountered it was unprepared for. Almost everyone. Wallace stopped his horse at the garden fence and looked at her, and she looked at him. "Good day," he said. "Very good," she said. "The lavender is established. It will come in fully next spring." "Edmund learned to whistle," Wallace said. "Demonstrate," she said to her son. Edmund demonstrated, which was to say he produced a sound that was in the general family of whistling and was very proud of it. She told him it was excellent because it was, for someone who had been working on it since yesterday. She walked to the horse and Wallace helped Edmund down to her, and she held her son against her side with the ease of a person who has learned the particular weight and configuration of someone they love, and she looked up at Wallace on the horse with the late September light making everything amber and rich. "Come back Sunday," she said to her husband. "I want to show you what Maggie has done with the south bed, and I want to talk about the spring plan for the north section." "I will be here," he said. "I know," she said. He rode ahead and she walked back along the creek road with Edmund's hand in hers, and the child talked about the horse and the whistling and a jackrabbit he had seen in the east pasture, and she listened to all of it with the full and genuine attention she gave to everything worth listening to. The years that followed were the years of building and growing and learning, which are the years that matter most even when they are quiet from the outside. Their children grew, Edmund Hayes Merritt into a solemn, capable boy who inherited his mother's precision and his father's patience, who by the age of 8 could drive a fence post as well as most men in the county, and who spent his Sunday afternoons reading anything he could get his hands on, borrowing from every literate household in a 5-mile radius. Clara Rose Merritt grew into a bright, forthright girl who said what she meant without softening it, which the schoolteacher found challenging and which her parents found entirely natural. The school in Caldwell improved. Della had continued her correspondence with the County Education Board and eventually, in 1885, been appointed to an advisory committee on the expansion of schooling in the region, which she approached with the same organized, evidence-based intensity she brought to everything. The school in Caldwell gained another teacher, a younger woman from Abilene named Helen Marsh, who had a teaching certificate and a cheerful competence that made her very good at her work. The Saturday market grew into a permanent weekly institution. Arthur Finch, who ran the general store, finally admitted in 1886 that Della's organization of the market, including her suggested layout, pricing guidelines, and seasonal scheduling, had improved the town's commercial health measurably. He said this to Wallace, not to Della directly, which was a limitation in Arthur Finch that he was working on. Wallace told Della. She was not surprised. She did not hold it against Arthur Finch. People moved at their own pace. In 1886, they had their third child, a son, born in March during a late winter storm that made the birth more dramatic in its backdrop than in its actuality, because Mrs. Reed was as efficient as she had always been, and Della was, by the third, very experienced. They named him James Samuel Merritt. He was a round, cheerful baby who became a round, cheerful boy, the easiest child in the family and the one who, his parents agreed, would probably be the surprise of all of them in adulthood. The house in the meadow had grown by this point. A second floor had been added in 1884, giving the children proper rooms, and a covered porch on the south side that ran the full length of the house, and was where, most evenings from April to October, Wallace and Della could be found after the children were in bed, sitting together in the last of the light or in the dark, talking or sometimes not talking. Sometimes they talked about the children. Sometimes about the land, the plans for next season, the state of the cattle market, a letter from an agricultural extension office about new techniques. Sometimes about larger things, the world outside Kansas, which was changing at the speed that the world always changes when you are not watching it every moment. The railroads were changing the cattle trade. The frontier, the concept of it, was already beginning to compress as more and more people came west, and the open range started to have different meanings. "This place is going to be different in 20 years, Wallace said, on an evening in the summer of 1887. "Every place is different in 20 years, Della said. "We will be different in 20 years. "Does that concern you?" She thought about it seriously, as she thought about everything seriously. "No," she said. "I came here to build something that would last. If it lasts into a different version of Kansas, it will last. The land is still here. The children are still here. We are still here." He took her hand in the dark of the porch, and the night sounds of the Kansas summer surrounded them, the cricket noise and the creek sound, and somewhere in the west meadow, an owl asking its question into the dark. "I want to say something," she said. "Say it." "When I got off that stagecoach in 1878, she said, "I had a very clear idea of what I was doing. I had a plan. The plan did not include you." "I know," he said, "and now I cannot imagine the plan without you in it," she said. "Not because you complete something I was missing. I was not missing anything, but because you are the best part of what came next. You are the part of this I did not plan for, and you are the part that made everything better." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel the quality of his attention even in the dark. "Della," he said. "Yes. You walked into this town and you changed it," he said. "Not because you tried to. Because you were simply yourself, without apology or performance, and the town had to figure out what to do with that. And I was the one who was prepared for it, not because I was exceptional, but because I had been waiting for someone who meant what they said." And there you were. She thought about that. She thought about the stagecoach and the land office and Gerald Cobb's face. She thought about Harlan Voss and the fence posts and the lawyer from Wichita. She thought about a February afternoon by a winter-cold creek and a July meadow and a Christmas dinner with one dog and two people who had not yet said the largest thing but were already in the middle of it. "We did well," she said. "We did very well," he said. In the autumn of 1888, 10 years after Della Hayes had stepped off the Caldwell stagecoach with one trunk and a carpet bag, there was a town gathering to mark the anniversary of the church's completion, which had happened in 1879, and which the minister, in the way of ministers who are also community historians, liked to commemorate. It was a Sunday gathering, outside in the good September weather, with food contributed by many households and children running between the legs of adults who were too busy talking to watch them carefully. Edmund Merritt was 7, old enough to carry his own plate and young enough to eat half his food while walking. Clara Rose was 5, holding her own plate with both hands and the focused expression of a girl who would not be helped unless she asked. James Samuel was 2 3/4, being carried on his father's arm and reaching for things on other people's plates. Della was moving between conversations because she knew most of the people here now, not in the way she had known people in Virginia, which was the way of living in close proximity to fixed social arrangements, but in the way she knew the land, from having worked it and understood it, from having been tested against it and held. Bessie Tallow stopped her and introduced her to a woman who had newly arrived from Arkansas with her husband, looking for land, looking for somewhere to set down. The woman was tentative in the way of new arrivals, unsure of the rules of the place. Della spoke with her directly and practically, and without condescension. She told her about the creek land and the soil and the market and the school. She told her where to file the claim papers and what questions to ask at the land office, and who at the land office was helpful, and who needed more information provided to them before they would be helpful. She told her about Mrs. Reed the midwife, because the woman looked like she might need that information in the next several months. The woman's name was Sarah, and she looked at Della with the expression of someone who has been looking for a map and has just been given one. "Thank you," Sarah said. "Thank you very much." "Welcome to Caldwell," Della said. She crossed the churchyard back toward her husband, who was standing with James on his arm and talking to Pete Haverson, who was now 60 and still had his mule and his philosophical attitude, and who had driven her out to the Hayes cabin on her very first day and asked if she was sure about this. She was sure about this. She reached Wallace and he shifted James to his other arm to make room for her at his side, which she filled without thinking, the way you fill a space that has become yours through long inhabiting. He glanced down at her with the look she knew best, the quiet, real, fully attentive one. "What were you telling her?" he said, nodding toward Sarah from Arkansas. "Everything useful I know about this county," Della said. "That took only a few minutes." "I was concise," she said. Pete Haverson laughed. Wallace laughed. James, infected by the general mood, laughed too, though he could not have said what was funny. The afternoon went on, warm and full of the ordinary, extraordinary things that make up a life well built. Children shouting somewhere, a fiddle starting up on the far side of the gathering, the smell of food and autumn air, the low light falling across the gathered people of Caldwell making everything golden and specific. Edmund appeared at Della's elbow. "Mama," he said, "there is a jackrabbit behind the church." "Is there?" she said. "A large one. Clara is trying to catch it." "Clara is not going to catch it," Della said. "I know, but she is certain she will." Della looked at her husband. "She gets that from you," she said. "She absolutely gets that from you," he said. "I'm never wrong," Della said. "Exactly," he said. She took Edmund's hand and went to observe the certainty of his sister, and Wallace watched her go across the churchyard in the September light, their son's hand in hers, her back straight and her stride purposeful, and the whole of her exactly as she had been when he had first looked at her across the creekside fence and thought, without quite knowing he was thinking it, that this was someone prepared for everything that was coming. He had been right. She had been right about most things. They had been right about each other, which was the most important right of all. Later, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet and the prairie dark had settled fully over the meadow, they sat on the south porch in the still warm air, and Della told him about the woman from Arkansas and what she had told her. "She was looking for a map," Della said, "and you had one." "I always had one," she said. "It just kept needing updating." He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they watched the stars come out over the Kansas sky, which was the largest sky she had ever seen and still surprised her sometimes with its completeness, the way it went from horizon to horizon without interruption, as though the world had opened itself up to show you everything it was made of. The creek moved somewhere in the dark. The house behind them held everything they had built. 40 acres on the South Fork of Bluff Creek bore the name Della Hayes Merritt in the county records, alongside 300 acres of Merritt land. The names joined but distinct, as they should be, as she had always known they should be. She had come here speaking only what she meant, and every man in town had been unprepared for that, the directness of it, the refusal to translate herself into something more comfortable. Except one. One man who had pulled a digging bar from his pack horse and crouched beside her fence post and talked about soil depth with the even attention of someone who had been waiting, without knowing it, for a person who meant everything they said. She had found him. He had been here, 3 miles east along the South Fork, patient and exact and real. They had built something that would last. She was absolutely certain of it, and she was never wrong.